This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I'll explain all that in just a second. Don't forget, you can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media, my columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, the other podcasts we've done, my photography website, and all that kind of good stuff is at hikingbob.com. And don't forget, you can also help support this podcast at Patreon, patreon.com/hikingbob. And help support this podcast to help me pay the bills that it takes to do this. Real quick note here, as many of you who've been listening to this for a long time know that the podcast recently went from being weekly to twice a month, but every once in a while we'll drop in an extra episode. You're going to hear some extra episodes over the next 2 months because there's a lot of things lined up, some special events coming up, but we're not changing things. It's still going to go back to being twice a month. And today I'm recording this special podcast because last week, if you listened to it, I talked about e-bikes and a policy that the city is rolling out. I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But I also want you to go back to listen to episode 416, which I talked about having people vote on things and whether people are smart enough to vote on these things. And there were some things that I said in the podcast, and I'll just explain real quick. When I do a live podcast that I'm recording with Kevin and I are talking, these things are unscripted, and sometimes things get conflated. You're running off the top of your head. So not everything I said was entirely correct. My opinions are still pretty much there. And I'm going to go through those things here real quickly. But I just want to explain why we're doing this podcast. I also have with me today, joining me, is Cory Sutela, who's the executive director of Medicine Wheel Trail Advocates. They were probably the oldest bike organization in Colorado Springs. Cory, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here. Nice to talk to you, Bob.
Nice to talk to you, too. And Cory will be on here in a little bit. He's going to expand a little bit on Medicine Wheel's opinion on the e-bike policy, e-bikes in general, and stuff like that. So just a couple of things I want to touch on that I talked about in the last podcast. The big thing was I made a real big mistake, and I said that the state required cities to have e-bikes on trails. That's not correct at all. There's no law requiring them to do that. However, they are encouraged to do that, I guess would be a way to put it. So definitely did not have a requirement from the state to have e-bikes on trails. The state does go in. There's some pretty good detail about defining e-bikes and things like that in their statutes, pretty much in compliance with every other ordinance that's been out there that defines them. I did also kind of get off on a tangent, and I did paint the people who are opposed to e-bikes with a little bit too broad of a brush. I think some people just oppose things because they just want to oppose things. However, many of the people who have these concerns about this e-bike policy are having these concerns over very legitimate reasons. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those here today. So before anybody starts yelling at me that I'm I hate painting anything with too broad of a brush, and I fell into that trap myself last week. Didn't mean to do that. In general, I'm going to say I still support the e-bike policy as presented by the Parks Department. You have to start someplace. I think this one is better researched than one they did some years ago, which I don't think anybody denies was not very good. Like any other thing, any other policy, any other plan, half the time laws and ordinances, there are going to be some tweaks, and I don't think anybody should expect that this will not need some refinement down the road. Technology changes. You can't think of everything from the outset. So while in general I support this policy as presented, let's acknowledge that there's probably going to have to be some tweaking done to this as we go down the road. While it may be legally possible, and there's a big maybe on that, for the city to enact this policy on top property without a vote, I think it's a bad idea to do that. I think politically, it's a very bad idea. Ethically, it's questionable. And I'm not saying that anybody who's acting here is acting unethical. I just think in the grand scheme of things, it's not a good idea to continue without subjecting this on top properties without a vote. And I'll just admit, a lot of times you get presented with something and on the surface looks like a good idea. And then as you sit down and you think about it a little bit and look into it a little deeper, you realize maybe not so much. That's kind of where I was at last week, where I said we don't need to have a vote on this. I think we do, at least on TOPS properties because they have specific restrictions that were voted in by the voters. So to change those, you need to have a vote of the people. And then as we get onto voting, I'm going to say it again, and it's been told to me in private, but somebody said it in public at a public meeting. I think it was a Parks Board meeting, that they don't think the voters are smart enough to make choices in an election. And I really don't like that opinion. I don't think people are smart enough to understand the technical differences here. I don't believe that to be true at all. And I think it's really insulting to the voters. The voters have been able to navigate their way around complex tax issues. Now, if they don't vote the way you want, then maybe you didn't do a good enough job educating them, whatever. But I don't like when I hear that people think the voters aren't smart enough to make these decisions. Sorry, that's just not the way it works. We when this country was founded, voting was restricted to rich landowners because they were considered to be the people only educated enough to make these decisions. Hardly the case as it should be. So last thing I want to hear is the voters aren't smart enough to make these choices. I think that now the city has an actual e-bike policy of some type. It can and should, and I've been saying this for a while, and my guest here, Cory's going to tell you, he's been saying this for a while, that they should implement it in places where they're not subject to top restrictions. And one of the easiest places for that is right across the street from my house. I can see it from here, is Palmer Park, which does not have any of these restrictions. And they could implement this policy, even if you want to call it a pilot program, in a place where it's not subject to top restrictions. None of this works without an enforcement capability. I've been beating this drum for a long time that the Parks Department just has not had a good enforcement capability. I'm not blaming anybody for it. It's just the way it is. But none of this works with these restrictions you're going to put in place without an enforcement thing. And it's going to be up to city council and the mayor to find the funding to allocate for more rangers. The Urban Ranger program is a good start, but they need to have people who are trained and have the authority to deal with infractions. It is a lacking part of the system. Again, I'm not blaming the Parks Department or anybody else's. I can tell you the Parks Department wants to have more enforcement. I think the legal department needs to look into and advise city council on how current staff can be used to enforce park regulations and city ordinances. You have to make everybody a police officer. There's ways around to do that. And I think none of this works without some type of enforcement arm. And it's really kind of lacking in this policy. I made mention to deed restrictions in the last podcast as being things that may restrict some use on parklands. Deed restriction was not the right word. There are some city parks that have deed restrictions. None of them would apply to this, but TOPS properties frequently come with conservation easements that have some restrictions. And what I meant to say was conservation easements, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking about some parks in the city that do indeed have deed restrictions, but they're typically related to alcohol use and things like that and buildings. None of them that I'm aware of. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but none of them that I'm aware of would apply to the e-bike policy. But there may be conservation easements that have restrictions on some of the top properties that do. They would have to be dealt with in an individual basis. And that may put a lot of this argument to naught, but I think we need to move on with that. So, Cory, again, thank you for being here. I think I hit all the things that I kind of got a little bit off a little bit, or maybe didn't make very clear on the last podcast. You listened to it. And I had come to this conclusion before we had even talked. And I had, even before you and I talked over the weekend, after thinking about that podcast, that I need to do one. I was just going to sit here and do this and just talk. But then I said, let's have Cory on here, and you offered to send some information. I thought it'd be better just to have you on here so you can unfiltered, intentionally, unintentionally. I mean, trust me, it'd be unintentional if I filtered it. So you could actually have your say. We could hear from your. Did I address all the things I kind of screwed up on the last podcast? I'm hoping I did.
Well, I wouldn't call it a screw up. There was a couple of things that I'd hope for the opportunity to clarify, and as always, appreciate the chance to speak to you and to speak to your listeners to clarify some of these things. Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate what you said. There are some properties that were donated to the city with deed restrictions. There are some properties that contain conservation easements, which is a legal contract. It's different than the deed restrictions. And then on top of that, we've got the TOPS ordinance, which specifically calls out non-motorized. So those are the kind of factors in there. And I think you did a good job unpacking that. So some of the things that I wanted to help, clear up some misunderstandings. First of all, there is a federal law. There's federal legislation that provides descriptions of e-bikes, and that's the class 1, 2, and 3 e-bikes. We've gone through what those classes are previously. So if you don't know what a class 1, 2, or 3 is, there's lots of resources to find that out. But the federal law provides the descriptions of those classes, and it describes how they should be tested for consumer safety. It says you should test them like a bicycle because they contain a lot of the same components. The brakes and the forks and the wheels are very similar to bicycles, and so you should test them that way. It does not say in any way that they're non-motorized, and it does not say in any way where they should be used. In 2017, we did have a Colorado state law, and this is really when MedWheel got deeply involved with it, was in the formation of this law. We were in discussions with Bicycle Colorado when this law went forward. And the 2017 state law adopts the federal definitions of class 1, 2, and 3. And it furthermore says that on CDOT roads and in CPW parks, class 1 and 2 are allowed where a traditional bike is allowed. It doesn't say they're non-motorized, but it says, hey, wherever the state has authority, which is CDOT roads and state parks, we're going to allow class 1 and 2 in the same places that a traditional bike is allowed. And we've seen some good success with that in state parks. The state law does not say anything about trails that are not managed by the state. So it doesn't purport to say what Colorado Springs should do on its trails. In 2019, there was an additional state law that says that e-scooters can't be restricted more than e-bikes. And honestly, I haven't seen this come up as a major discussion point across the state in the intervening, 5 or 7 years. I'm not aware of e-scooters being used all over our soft surface trails. But the current proposal the city has brought forward would allow e-scooters on our soft surface open space trails. And I'm hearing a lot of concerns about that. I mean, there are definitely some concerns about e-bikes, but e-scooters are a whole different ball of wax on our open space trails. And I'm hearing some concern that we'd want to be careful about that. So the state law around e-scooters is a factor that we have to weed through here. Another clarification I hope to add was about the ADA status. So there is very good reason why we want to improve access for more people on our trails and our park system. One reason is ADA laws, and everyone should be aware that today we are in compliance with the ADA requirements. Now, does that mean we're doing enough to encourage inclusivity on our trails? I don't think so. I think we need to do more we need more opportunities for, track chairs and other devices like that. And I'm happy to see that progressing around the city. We need more adaptive mountain bikes. So these sort of 3-wheel devices that some people use. There are lots of ways that we can be more inclusive of people with disabilities on our trails, and we need to do that. And not just that, we need to be inclusive of older people and, socioeconomic diversity. We need to improve our diversity on our trails, and there are some efforts underway for that. And so, that's a consideration that must be addressed. It's not exactly tied, and it's not a problem that needs to be solved in the way that the city has proposed. The other important clarification I want to make is that Medicine Wheel supports a thoughtful and legal expansion of e-bikes in our park system, including on TOPS properties, and we have for many years. And Bob, in preparation for this, I'd sent you an email that I'd shared with park staff in 2019 that really contains a lot of the same information and outlines a pathway that we proposed would be legal and thoughtful to bring e-bikes forward in a way that will be supported by our community. And I know, our park system is overall underfunded, especially when it comes to enforcement. But I do think that our park staff need to be a bit accountable for the fact that they've essentially not taken this, by the horns years and years ago, and it's a shame that we haven't had a more thoughtful approach from some years ago. But that's in the past. Best time to plant an oak tree is 20 years ago. The second best time's today. So let's do our best to get it right today.
Well, and in your defense, Cory, you have, and you and I have talked many times over the years in this podcast. You have brought up the e-bike thing for a number of years, and you guys have been consistent in your approach to this. So while that's in the past, it's consistent with where you're at today.
Okay, yeah, thanks for recalling that. So yeah, just to clarify, we've always advocated that there should be a thoughtful expansion. We've always advocated that e-bikes should be managed separately from mountain bikes. So it's a new device. It's not bad or good. It's a different device, and we want to manage it separately. And we have always pushed back against some kind of a definition that, some motors aren't really motors. That's a very confusing statement for anyone that's not right in the middle of this. And those are obviously a lot of people that we talk to as we're building consensus amongst a broad group of people here. So to just say some motors aren't motors, we don't like that approach. And really, since 2017, we have, as you have, Bob, we have pushed hard for education, enforcement, and data collection so that we can implement some adaptive management on these, as e-bikes and e-devices change over time. We want to be able to collect data, and we really think we can put those processes in place today. We can add education, enforcement, and data collection, and we could have done this 5 years ago, and we really got to get ahead of that. I also want to say that MedWheel, the e-bike task force that was set up by the park staff that I was a part of, and several other community members were, the TOPS Working Committee, the City of Colorado Springs Parks Board, the El Paso County Parks Board, and nearly everybody I talked to has consistently stated support for expansion of e-mobility devices on the urban trail network, and with the caveat, it's got to be accompanied with some kind of speed and behavior enforcement. There's a little bit more to figure out there. What kind of devices? How do we do it? But overall, we would like to see a broader range of mobility devices allowed on our urban trails to help people get out of cars and have mobility options. It'll make our whole bike transportation network safer to have more people using it, but it's got to be accompanied by some enforcement. When it comes to open space trails, MedWheel has always advocated for a thoughtful and careful expansion and not just a blanket approach to allow e-bikes everywhere a bike is allowed. And I can point to some specific trails, particularly where e-bikes in an uphill direction would not be compatible with today's uses and would really change the use. As I understand it, the proposal from staff would allow a trail by trail assessment of, they would still retain the ability to allow e-bikes on some and not others. It's not clear how that would work, but we think that's an important aspect of any policy. The next thing I wanted to really clear up is just a little history about the TOPS program. And Bob, you'll have to forgive me because I know you know all this, but TOPS was enacted in 1997. It was a petitioned ballot, so it wasn't referred by council. So a petition ballot means it takes a huge effort by the community. It was passed in 97 on the third try, and it was really led by a very influential group of conservationists in our community. And the measure was implemented in response to our chronically underfunded Parks Department that did not have the funds to acquire new park spaces. And they were seeing all of, Colorado Springs was just being gobbled up by development, and there was no mechanism for the city to purchase open spaces. And so it took 3 tries. They got it through in 97. There was a lot of compromise and debate. I'm happy to tell you that, MedWheel was formed in the late 80s and sort of officialized in the early 90s. And MedWheel members at that time, as long before I was involved, were involved with those discussions and were part of the coming up with the language that included non-motorized. Now, that doesn't hold us to say, hey, we are non-motorized forever in TOPS. We do recognize that things have changed and e-bikes are valuable in our community and society, and they've got all kinds of benefits. And we think it is time for an update, but we remain opposed to making a change on TOPS properties that doesn't involve a vote of the people. We think it's really essential. It's not the easiest thing in the world. We've got to do some work to come up with the right language, but it is important to honor the strength of the TOPS program, that we don't, essentially what the proposal from the city staff at this point, it proposes to make a new definition for a standard term, which is non-motorized. And while it's true that non-motorized is not explicitly defined in the TOPS ordinance, there's a whole list of things that aren't explicitly defined. And the reason is because they're part of the common lexicon of the English language. And so coming up with a new definition for a standard term, we think doesn't support the TOPS program in the long run. I won't comment on the political strategy behind it, but it's certain to alienate a large segment of our population that believes in the strength of the TOPS program, and it potentially could be damaging in the long run when other changes are wanted to be proposed to TOPS. And hey, guess what? We're going to just make up a new definition for something that everyone already agreed was a standardized term. So I think that's really dangerous, and we won't support a change to that language without a ballot measure. Couple of just continuing on about the TOPS program, because we were involved in those discussions, because we were involved, MedWill was involved, also in the Bear Creek Roundtable. For decades, we have built positive, constructive relationships with these conservation groups and other user groups. And we've reached out to people that don't have the same long-term values or goals in terms of mountain biking. A lot of these groups don't like bikes to begin with. Right. And yet by compromising and negotiating and operating in good faith, we've built constructive relationships. And that is the reason why mountain bikers today enjoy world-class mountain biking on a trail network that rivals, some of the best trail networks in the world. And I'll put an asterisk there. We are a city of the latest estimate, 490,000 people. We're the 39th largest city in the country. We don't live near a ski area. We are not a community that's going through a transition from oil and gas or mining and needs to find a way. And recreation is the way we're going to save our economy. Recreation is a very important part of our economy, but we have a very broad-based economy here, and it includes a lot of interests, not just mountain bikes. And for years, Medicine Wheel has observed that our access to use this wonderful trail system really depends on us working with other groups and considering other users and conservationists as well. So we think that's really important. And to try to, to sort of do an end around to sidestep the requirements of TOPS, that would be really an affront to a lot of those groups. And we think it's not appropriate. So again, I want to be clear, we do not oppose the expansion of e-bike access. It's very clear we need more of it on our urban trail system, and we also want to do it thoughtfully on our open space trails. Medicine Wheel is not the voice. We're certainly not the only voice that's expressing concern here, but we are in contact with a lot of people that are voicing really valid concerns about this. And frankly, some groups that have already told us that they would consider mounting a legal challenge to the proposal. And, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that would be a fairly easy thing for them to win. So those are the points that I really hope that we'll be able to share, and be happy to, discuss or dig in any more on those, and, express gratitude for the chance to bring those forward.
Well, Cory, I'm glad you came on. I'm glad I had you on to explain it. I could not have, if you sent me notes, have explained it nearly as well as you did. So I'm glad that, that you were willing to come on. You've always been willing to come on the podcast and talk. So there's nothing new. I think I took a little bit of a hit because I definitely made it sound like last week that I thought we could do this without a vote. Definitely a gross misstatement. As you know, I have fought against making changes to the TOPS ordinance that did not require a vote of the people. My stance still stands. What I was happy about when this policy came out was we finally had definitions, because earlier there was moves to change the TOPS ordinance or there was discussion about it without defining what you were actually looking for. Does that make any sense? So I think now we have defined things, defined uses. That's what I like about this e-bike policy is there's some definitions in there. That's a step towards now we can take something to the people and say, can we do this? Now, is it going to be completely like it is right now? I don't know. Refinements would have to be made, I'm sure. Way above my head. And I'm not on the committee anymore. So I'm just another voice that is being heard. I don't sit on the committee. My time was up and it was time for me to go. And other people who are very good are now sitting on those committees and parks boards, and they get to make the choice. But we have to, as citizens, as groups like yourself, have to be heard. So my opinion is that while I don't think this is a bad policy, I think that implementing it in TOPS properties by changing by rewording things is probably not the direction to go. I think it needs to be voted on. But I'm glad they've defined uses and defined things like that, and they've explained it, and they have examples of where this is at other places. If you remember the policy they rolled out in 2017, I think it was 2017. It was really not a good policy. It was shelved almost immediately because it was just bad policy. It wasn't very well researched.
There was a proposal in Garden of the Gods, I think in 2019 or 2020, and then they proposed a 1-year e-bike pilot in 2021, and the day before it went into force, the city legal department let them know they thought it wasn't legal. Well, I really appreciate you saying that about the definitions. So yeah, now the proposal would be to accept the federal and state definitions of class 1, 2, and 3 e-bikes and scooters, which is an important part, but it's also not sufficient. So that was one of the most important things raised in the e-bike task force that came out, was a need for definitions. We also are lacking a definition of urban versus open space trail. We all kind of understand what those mean, but those definitions need to be added. The other thing that is currently missing in any city code or ordinance is any sort of penalties for breaking the ordinance. And so this kind of hasn't made the headlines, but that is also part of the proposal, would be to enact, hey, these are the penalties for breaking the law. And we think that's also sorely overdue. So expanding those definitions and those ordinances are a great move forward. It's a great step in the right direction. We would say before making a policy change, we really need to see the enforcement and education piece thought through. So far, the proposal has been, hey, let's just get this policy change done, and then we can figure out enforcement and education later. Especially if we're not tied to a timeline for a specific ballot, which is now the proposal. I don't understand why we would rush through to change a policy without providing a viewpoint for education and enforcement. Again, has been suggested by you for years and supported by TOPS, both Parks Board and the city and county, and nearly everybody that I talk to. Those pieces are essential and need to get put in place. So it's good to see some progress finally, but rushing through to make a policy change without some of these necessary things, I think, is going to hurt e-bike and mountain bike access in the long run in our community. We want to make sure we get this right.
Yeah, and the next time this could possibly be voted on would be April. And believe it or not, that would actually come up really quickly, considering that we're already halfway through October, that by the time you had ballot language ready for April would have to be, I believe, by February sometime. Don't hold me to that, but it would be a lot sooner than you would think. So it is something that, if we're going to put on a ballot, if we want it by April, they would actually have to act pretty quickly. And I don't know that
it's probably too late for April by now.
I would think it would be too.
Develop language, get it approved by TOPS and Parks Board and referred by council in time for April would be a superhuman effort that I don't think is likely. But if that were the case, we would for sure support that and do everything we could. We've shared several proposals that provide a pathway that include a citizen's ballot. And it'd be great if we could do that in April. I'm currently not seeing that happening, but I could be wrong.
Can we agree that this is a step in the right direction, but just needs more work?
Yeah, it's finally some movement, and providing the definitions is really important, but we can't support it if it sidesteps TOPS by making up new definitions. And we we would like to see the enforcement and education pieces in place first.
I would say, notwithstanding that we both agree, they also need a vote to changes on tops. That we are finally making progress after many years, and I've been critical of the Parks Department for this. That this has just languished way too long with developing a policy, and in the meantime, these e-bikes have gotten out there. Technology has changed, and every year that this gets further pushed back, we're further and further behind the eight ball, which I think is why the city is moving to do something quickly. Okay, I get that, but it's also their fault that we're at this point where we're trying to act real quickly because they just sat on their hands for so long with this and nothing much happened with it. So they kind of put themselves in this position.
If I may, the other major issue is, certainly for the last 3 years, the consistent message from city staff has been, hey, there is a legal requirement that's set up in the TOPS ordinance.
Right.
And we must go to a ballot. And really, it's only been about 2 weeks that we've learned, oh, you know what, we've decided to go a different direction. And that really does seem rushed to have messaging for many years saying, hey, this is the right way to do it. We're going to figure it out. And then to suddenly take a different path. That's difficult to accept. And I think a lot of people are asking to slow down, not because they want it to take many, many more years, but really this proposal's only been around for a couple of weeks and it's got some problems. And so I think that's why people are, raising these concerns and asking to put the brakes on pushing it through TOPS and Parks Board.
Well, I'll admit that as somebody who has been beating the drum that we need to vote, part of my argument there was because it was bolstered by the city attorneys having the same opinion. And then all of a sudden they go do a 180 on this. I'm like, wait a minute, you just hung me out to dry because I've been supporting you. And not only, I wasn't supporting it because I was just mimicking the city attorney. I was supporting it because I believe that was the case. Everything that's ever happened with TOPS happened to a vote. And I'm sitting there going, you need a vote, you need a vote, you need a vote. And the city attorney agrees with me. And now I'm saying you need a vote. And all of a sudden the city attorney goes, no, maybe not so much. Like, well, wait a minute.
Well, and
hold the phone.
For the benefit of your listeners, Bob, we should explain why that's the case. I mean, what the city is doing is actually, I think, at this step is not illegal. What they're saying is, hey, we're not going to change the TOPS measure at all, the TOPS ordinance. Right. We're going to provide a broader definition for what non-motorized is as a blanket statement in the city, and then that will automatically apply to TOPS. Therefore, we don't have to change TOPS. Right. That's sort of a sleight of hand. It's a bit of a trick to get around the requirements of TOPS. And again, the TOPS program is probably the best thing that the citizens of Colorado Springs have done for themselves in the last 100 years. Right. And it's really important. And we do not want to get in the practice of sidestepping that. So strictly speaking, they haven't changed the opinion that you'd have to have a ballot to modify TOPS. The right. proposal is that we get around it by changing a definition for non-motorized
right.
outside TOPS.
And I want to make it clear that what I'm saying that is referring to the use of motorized devices, that we've been of the opinion that you needed a vote to do that. And then all of a sudden they found a way around it. I kind of feel like I was put out there. In any case, that's my fault. I should say even my fault. I still think that whatever we're doing here should be voter approved for the TOPS properties. The city has plenty of other properties that they don't need voter approval to do this. You and I have been in agreement. We've talked about this for a long time. You came up with the plan to put this in Palmer Park because it's a great park to do it in. It's big. It's got a lot of trails. It could handle it. It's a great pilot program. Put it in Palmer Park, see how it works. It could. The resistance to that I still haven't been able to understand.
I think Palmer Park doesn't meet all the desires of e-bike riders. Let's be clear about that. It's not a perfect solution, but Palmer Park is a place, and we discussed this with the Guardians of Palmer Park, and we brought it forward as a proposal last year. It is a place where we could try e-bikes on soft surface trails. It's a nice contained park where we could observe and measure, and we could use that to show that we've got a great community of trail users that are going to support good trail sharing, and we could expand from there. It's something that we could build on. In the last year, I still have yet to hear back from park staff as to why we couldn't do that, other than, well, we'd like to do the whole thing all at once. I appreciate that too. Yeah, we'd like to do it all at once, but I just don't think it's feasible in this case. And if we were able to step into it, we have an opportunity to build support for bigger changes on our TOPS properties.
Yeah, and Colorado Springs is very unique. We've talked about this a lot. Very unique in this TOPS measure, which was voter approved, like you said, and citizen initiated, which comes with constraints on how things are done. It's not common in many parts of the country to have this kind of a situation like this. So we are unique. And part of the problem has been educating groups from outside the state who have advocated for this, who've consistently argued it's not necessary to have the voters approve it. And we've argued it has. I still think it is. I will say the other thing about the e-bike task force, well, I think everybody on the task force did a great job. It was concerning to me at the time, and I expressed those concerns. And it's still concerning to me that members of the sitting TOPS Working Committee and Park Advisory Board were excluded from participating on that. And they were told that they were excluded because they had extrajudicial or, bull. Sorry, they should not have been left out of the thing. And I expressed that opinion because the Parks Advisory Board and TOPS Working Committee don't create policy. They just make suggestions or recommendations. They should have been included in that. They were left out. For whatever reasons, I still something that's a kind of like a burr in my saddle that they should not have been. Representatives from both should have been included in that. Not previous representatives, which were fine. They were great people, but current members of the committee should have been allowed on there.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I raised those same concerns at the time. I would also say the e-bike survey that the city put out this year also had a bunch of problems with it and wasn't done properly. It was confusing to a lot of people, and most would say it's not sufficient to drive policy. So there were problems with the task force and with the with that survey.
The e-bike survey, I don't think the questions on the e-bike survey were bad, but and staff has acknowledged that it wasn't made clear that it wasn't either or. You could have voted for both options. You could have voted against both options, one or the other. People are accustomed to, when they see two choices, of being of the opinion they have to make it either or, and that was not the case. And I think that was the biggest flaw in that survey was it wasn't made clear you could have voted for both if you thought both were good.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was the biggest flaw. The other major flaw was, do you think people really understood they were voting to allow e-scooters on our open space trails? I don't think that was clear. And I think what was missing was what other kinds of personal electric mobility devices would we like to see on our urban trail network, which connects with our on-street bike network? And, how can we really drive, the non-car transportation and use our parks trail system for transportation? I think there's really strong interest throughout our community for that. And that wasn't really reflected in the survey.
Yeah. Like anything, making laws, what's the old joke? Two things people should never see made: sausage and laws, and policy, apparently, because it's just pretty ugly stuff. And I'm not, and again, my use of words, when I say pretty ugly, it's not that I don't think it's anything dishonest. I just think it's way more complicated than people think. But it's just, these are things people have to consider. In any case, Cory, thanks again for being on the podcast. I think you and I are both in agreement that steps forward need to be made. I think this is a start. I think that the city should, I still think putting it in Palmer Park or a legacy park that's not subject to the motorized use descriptions that are, encumbered in the TOPS ordinance would be a way to pilot program this, see how it works, dispel a lot of rumors. And we won't even get started in all the myths that surround e-bikes. For example, the speeds are based on flat land, so they don't go that fast going uphill. People don't seem to understand that because it hasn't been explained. There's a lot of things that I think could happen going forward from here. It remains to be seen how it will be. I will probably speak at either the TOPS and or Park Advisory Board meetings coming up in November when they're planning on taking formal votes on recommending this. I would be shocked if you're not present at either of those meetings, along with a lot of other people. The only other thing I want to say is some of the people opposed to this are just like, and you kind of alluded to, people who just hate mountain bikes and hate mountain bikers And boy, I'm getting tired of hearing that sentiment. We heard a lot about it in the Blodgett open space thing, where we were planning that some people just have this unreasonable animosity towards mountain bikers. And I'm tired of hearing that, because my opinion, and I've expressed it to you, is the behavior of mountain bikers has improved greatly over the last several years. Most of my encounters with them are very good. That they've gotten much better in acknowledging trail etiquette and other users on the trail. And I could point to all kinds of bad behavior from hikers, but somehow hikers think that they're immune from all those kind of things. So let's knock it off with the demonizing of other users out there.
Well, I think that's a fair point. Maybe I would just say, there are a lot of people that don't choose to mountain bike, and it's not their highest priority, and they don't want to see this expansion. And it's our role as mountain bikers is to do some outreach and to continue to try to improve trail sharing with those folks. It's not just that they hate mountain bikes. That's not why they love our top spaces, either bird watching or dog walking or whatever. And mountain biking has an impact on that. And we just need to recognize that we share our trails with all of these groups.
Right.
We can't try and end around to just get what we want in the short term.
Right. I agree. All right, my friend. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Hopefully this clears things up for people. Probably going to be a bazillion more questions. I urge people to attend the TOPS Working Committee meeting, first Wednesday of the month, the Park Advisory Board meeting, the second Thursday of the month. And this is going to again go to City Council. Make your opinions heard. I can tell you that having sat on the TOPS Working Committee for 6 years, we do listen to everything that is brought up, and we do see every single email that people send in that does weigh in on our things. We're not ignoring people up there. And I can tell you that even judging from comments of the last Park Advisory Board meeting that were published, certainly not a rubber stamp for what the Parks Department does. We're there. They're there. I keep saying we. I'm not there anymore. They're there to be the representatives of the public. Let them know your opinions on this. If you have another idea, present it. People want to hear this. We can't make decisions. They can't make decisions in a vacuum. So for the people listening to this, get a hold of your representatives, your Park Advisory Board, your TOPS Working Committee. They have all in one emails. You can send it to them. Everybody gets it. And they would definitely like to hear from you. And then make your presence known at the meetings too.
Yep, totally agree. This is the time for the public to have their input. So again, Bob, thank you for the opportunity to clarify a few things, and hopefully that will help prepare some people when they do choose to bring their voices forward in these public forums.
And who knows, people may be just fine with it too. We don't know until we hear from them. And with that, Cory and everybody else, thank you for listening and being on the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast.
Thank you.